Before the soldiers arrived, before the reservation boundaries were drawn across land that had never recognized such lines, before the political machinery of Washington began producing documents that would reshape the entire geography of the American Southwest, an Apache family was already awake. Not because dawn demanded it in any formal sense, but because the world they inhabited rewarded wakefulness and punished the alternative with a finality that left no room for argument. The mother had assessed the wind direction before opening her eyes fully. The father had listened to the specific quality of the silence outside the dwelling, not its presence, which would have been ordinary, but its texture, which told him whether the birds had fallen quiet in the way that meant weather or in the way that meant something else entirely. The older members of the family unit had already catalogued, from the sounds and smells of early morning, a preliminary picture of what the day ahead held. This was not anxiety. It was the specific attentiveness of people who had built a civilization on the ability to read a dangerous world with precision, and who had been doing so across generations that stretched back further than any written record of the region existed. Understanding how Apache families survived in genuinely dangerous times requires dismantling a set of popular assumptions so thoroughly embedded in American cultural imagination that they function almost as invisible axioms, assumptions about what Apache life was, what it meant to be a family within it, what survival actually entailed when the threats came not only from the natural environment, but from the sustained, organized, and increasingly well-equipped military pressure of two nation-states simultaneously. The Spanish colonial system had been pressing against Apache territorial integrity for more than a century before American expansion entered the equation. The Mexican government that succeeded it maintained and intensified that pressure. The United States added a third force with resources and organizational reach that neither of its predecessors had possessed. Apache families in the period from roughly 1850 through the 1880s were navigating a world in which the threats to their existence were not hypothetical or occasional, but constant, structural, and escalating. The survival strategies they employed in response were correspondingly sophisticated, not desperate improvisation under pressure, but the application of deeply developed cultural intelligence to conditions of genuine extremity. The family, as Apache society organized it, was not the nuclear unit of American domestic ideology. It was an extended kinship network whose boundaries were simultaneously more fluid and more functionally significant than the family structures of the Euro-American settlers pressing into the Southwest. A family in the Apache sense encompassed multiple generations, multiple households linked by blood and marriage, and a web of reciprocal obligations that distributed resources, labor, childcare, and protection across a group large enough to sustain itself through adversity that would have destroyed smaller units. When one component of this network was pressed, when a husband was injured, when a mother was ill, when a portion of the group's food resources was lost to drought or raid, the extended family structure functioned as a resilience mechanism, redistributing what was available and absorbing the stress through collective capacity, rather than concentrating it on individuals who might be overwhelmed by it alone. The rancheria, the semi-permanent encampment that formed the basic residential unit of Apache social organization, was designed from every element of its construction to serve survival in both its physical and social dimensions. The wiki-ups that sheltered Apache families were engineering achievements disguised as simple structures, built from a specific combination of flexible poles, brush, and whatever additional insulating material the local environment provided, in configurations that could be erected rapidly, dismantled even more rapidly, and transported with a logistical efficiency that no contemporary mobile military unit could match. A family that needed to move because scouts had reported approaching soldiers, because water sources in the current location were failing, because the season demanded relocation to higher elevation, could deconstruct their entire dwelling in the time it took a less practiced observer to saddle a horse. The speed of this deconstruction was not merely practical. It was a survival asset of the first order in an era when the ability to vanish from a location before hostile parties arrived was frequently the difference between continued existence and the alternative. The positioning of a rancheria in the landscape reflected a security consciousness so thoroughly integrated into daily decision-making that it appeared to outside observers who lacked the analytical framework to understand it as simply the random placement of camps in convenient locations. In reality, every rancheria was positioned according to a consistent set of tactical principles. Elevation sufficient to provide observation of approaching parties from multiple directions. Access to water that could not be easily cut off by a force positioning itself between the camp and the source. Escape routes in at least two directions that led to terrain where the specific movement capabilities of Apache families, their speed on foot, their ability to traverse ground that stopped horses, their knowledge of the specific landscape, gave them decisive advantage over pursuers. The encampment was not just a place to sleep. It was a defensive position, chosen with the care that any competent military commander would apply to the selection of ground. And the women who were primarily responsible for establishing and managing the camp brought to that selection the same tactical intelligence that the men brought to external scouting and raiding. Right now, wherever you're watching from, whether that's Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, or somewhere halfway across the world, drop a comment and tell us where you are. This history belongs to everyone, and we genuinely want to know who's in this community with us. Water was the axis around which all Apache survival planning rotated, and the depth of Apache water knowledge across the territories they inhabited represents one of the most remarkable bodies of practical environmental intelligence that any human community has ever developed and maintained. The specific location of every reliable spring, every seasonal seep, every tinaja carved by centuries of erosion into the desert rock, every underground source betrayed by specific surface vegetation patterns, this knowledge was maintained as living community memory, transmitted across generations through a combination of direct instruction, experiential learning, and the narrative traditions that embedded geographical information in forms that made it both memorable and transmissible to people who had not yet traveled to the locations being described. An Apache elder describing the water sources of a mountain range he had crossed 40 years earlier was not reminiscing. He was performing an act of practical education, transmitting operationally critical information to members of the group who might need to find those sources under conditions of genuine urgency. The management of water as a resource extended beyond knowing where sources were located to understanding their seasonal behavior, their current condition, and their tactical implications. A water source in Apache country was never simply a place to drink. It was a predictable gathering point for animals, which made it a hunting resource, and for human parties of every kind, which made it a surveillance and security concern. Apache families approaching a known water source in potentially hostile territory did so with an operational care that reflected this dual nature. Scouts sent ahead, approach from elevation that permitted observation before commitment, assessment of tracks and other signs for evidence of recent use by parties whose identity and intentions were unknown. Drinking from a spring in the Sonoran Desert in the 1870s was not a casual act. It was a tactically considered event, and Apache families approached it accordingly. The seasonal movement patterns that Apache families maintained were not nomadism, in the random sense the term is sometimes applied to indigenous peoples who did not practice sedentary agriculture. They were precise, annually calibrated circuits through specific territories, timed to align with the seasonal availability of specific food resources, and to use the specific characteristics of different elevations and terrain types as both nutritional and security assets. Summer heat in the lowland desert was managed by movement to higher elevations where temperatures were cooler, vegetation more diverse, and certain food resources abundant during specific weeks of the season. Winter cold at elevation was managed by descent to lower, more sheltered terrain, where the thermal mass of canyon walls provided meaningful protection from the temperature extremes of open country. This vertical migration, moving up and down through elevation bands in response to seasonal conditions, was a strategy refined across generations of careful observation into a system of almost calendar-like precision. The food systems that sustained Apache families through these seasonal circuits were built on a nutritional intelligence about the specific landscape of the Southwest that went deeper than any botanical or zoological survey of the period could capture. Every plant resource in the Apache territory, every grass whose seeds were worth harvesting, every cactus whose fruit was edible at the right stage of ripeness, every root whose starch content rewarded the labor of excavation, every berry that could be eaten fresh or dried for later use, was known with the specificity of location, season, preparation method, and nutritional quality that made the difference between a food resource and an overlooked plant. Mescal, the agave plant whose hearts, when pit-roasted over extended periods, produced a dense, calorie-rich food that stored for extended periods without spoilage, was among the most critical plant foods in the Apache repertoire, and the communal mescal roasts that produced it were major events in the food calendar, bringing extended family groups together for the collective labor of harvest, preparation, and the prolonged cooking process that transformed the raw plant into preserved nourishment. Game hunting supplemented this plant-based foundation with protein sources that the landscape provided in varying abundance depending on season and location. Apache hunters were extraordinarily capable. Their tracking skills, their knowledge of animal behavior and movement patterns, their ability to approach game under conditions where the animal's senses were fully engaged, their accuracy with both bow and, increasingly through the later 19th century, firearms. But the Apache approach to hunting was not simply a matter of individual skill applied opportunistically. It was a systematic exploitation of specific landscape features, seasonal animal behaviors, and community coordination that maximized yield from the available animal resources while avoiding the over-exploitation that would have degraded those resources over time. The same landscape intelligence that informed movement planning and water management informed hunting practice, and the family groups that hunted together brought to the effort the same collective knowledge base that they applied to every other dimension of their survival. Women's roles in Apache family survival were as operationally significant as men's, and the division of labor that Apache society maintained was not a hierarchy of importance, but a functional specialization that distributed different but equally critical responsibilities across the group's members, according to the specific capabilities and social positions that the culture had developed over generations. The gathering of plant foods, which in some seasons constituted the majority of the family's caloric intake, was primarily women's work, and the botanical knowledge it required was genuine expertise, transmitted through apprenticeship from experienced gatherers to younger women, learning both the identification of specific plants and the specific techniques of harvest that maximized yield without damaging the plant's future productivity. A woman who knew the exact moment of optimal ripeness for the fruit of a specific cactus species, who could identify the underground indicators of a root crop's readiness for harvest by the above-ground appearance of a plant that most observers couldn't have identified at all, was applying knowledge of real depth and practical consequence. The processing and preservation of food was another domain of women's expertise that had direct survival significance. The ability to transform raw food resources into preserved forms that could be stored and transported, dried fruit, pounded jerky, dried seeds, pit-roasted mescal, extended the temporal reach of the family's food supply from the moment of harvest or kill through the weeks and months when that specific resource would not be available. Preservation techniques were not simple. They required specific knowledge of the processes that made food safe for extended storage, the conditions that preserved nutritional value while preventing spoilage, and the packaging and transport methods that protected stored food through the physical demands of the family's mobile existence. Women who managed these processes well gave their families a buffer against the unpredictable, a reserve that could sustain life through the disruptions that dangerous times produced with irregular frequency. This is the kind of history that almost never makes it into the classroom. And if you've been finding this valuable, take a second right now and share this video with someone. History this real deserves a wider audience than it usually gets. The social structure that governed Apache family life was maintained and transmitted primarily through women in ways that the patriarchal lens of 19th-century American observation consistently failed to recognize or document accurately. Apache social organization was matrilineal. Descent and family identity were reckoned through the mother's line, and residence after marriage was typically matrilocal, meaning that a married couple lived with or near the wife's family rather than the husband's. This meant that the core of a stable Apache family group was a woman, her daughters, and her daughters' husbands and children, a female-centered network of kinship around which male members rotated according to the obligations of hunting, raiding, and scouting that took them away from the residential base for extended periods. The senior woman of this group was not a peripheral figure. She was the operational anchor of the family's domestic economy, and her knowledge, judgment, and organizational capability were the practical foundation of the group's continued functioning. The transmission of cultural knowledge, the entire body of environmental intelligence, social protocol, spiritual practice, historical memory, and practical skill that constituted Apache civilization was a process that happened continuously and deliberately within family life. Every interaction between elder and younger family members was a potential educational event, and the elders of an Apache family took the responsibility of cultural transmission with a seriousness that reflected a clear understanding of what was at stake. In dangerous times, when the disruption of family structures by violence, displacement, and forced separation was a real and recurrent threat, the concentrated transmission of as much knowledge as possible to younger members became an urgent priority. Children who knew the water sources, who could identify the edible plants, who understood the tactical principles of movement through hostile territory, who carried in their bodies and their minds the cultural inheritance of the group. These children represented the group's future capacity for survival in a more immediate and literal sense than is true in societies where institutional structures preserve and transmit cultural knowledge independently of family continuity. The spiritual framework within which Apache family life was conducted was not separable from the practical dimensions of survival in the way that contemporary secular thinking tends to separate religious observance from functional daily life. Apache spiritual practice was a continuous, integrated dimension of engagement with the world, not reserved for ceremonial occasions, but present in the routine encounters and decisions of every day. The songs sung during food preparation, the prayers offered before a hunt, the specific ritual attentions paid to significant events in the landscape, a thunderstorm, a first sighting of a seasonal plant, the appearance of a specific animal, were not decorative additions to a practical life. They were a mode of relationship with the world that the Apache inhabited, a framework for perceiving and responding to the environment that operated simultaneously on practical and spiritual registers in ways that the culture did not divide. Medicine, the treatment of illness and injury, was embedded in this integrated spiritual practical framework in ways that make its effectiveness comprehensible even to an entirely secular analytical framework. Apache healers combined genuine pharmacological knowledge of the specific plant compounds available in the Southwest with ritual practices that served what we would now recognize as psychological functions, the management of anxiety and pain through focused attention, the maintenance of hope and community solidarity through the shared performance of healing ceremony, the signaling of collective care and commitment that itself has measurable effects on healing outcomes. A seriously injured Apache family member was not treated in isolation by a detached specialist. They were treated in the presence of family, with the participation of multiple community members, through a process that addressed the psychological and social dimensions of serious illness simultaneously with its physical aspects. The management of conflict within Apache society, between individuals, between family groups, and between the Apache as a whole and the external powers pressing against their territorial integrity, was another domain of sophisticated social intelligence that Apache families maintained and transmitted. The internal social mechanisms for resolving disputes without violence, the authority of elder women in mediating family conflicts, the role of respected leaders in adjudicating disputes between groups, the specific cultural protocols that allowed grievances to be expressed and addressed without escalating to the destructive confrontations that unmanaged conflict produced, were as much a survival technology as any physical skill. A family group that could not maintain internal cohesion under pressure, that allowed conflict to fracture the kinship networks on which its resilience depended, was a family group whose capacity to survive dangerous times was fundamentally compromised. Tell us what you think in the comments. What part of this story surprised you the most? We read every comment, and your responses genuinely shape what we cover next. The specific forms that danger took for Apache families shifted and intensified through the course of the 19th century in ways that demanded continuous adaptation of survival strategies that had been effective under earlier conditions. The Spanish colonial policy of intermittent military pressure, combined with peace establishment programs, the establishment of presidios near Apache territory, the periodic offering of rations and trade relationships as incentives for reduced raiding, had created a complex negotiated relationship that, while never stable, provided occasional periods of reduced acute threat, within which family life could function with somewhat reduced defensive intensity. The Mexican government that inherited this system lacked the resources to maintain even its inconsistent predecessor, and the policy that replaced it, the declaration of formal war against the Apache, the payment of scalp bounties, and the authorization of militia campaigns into Apache territory, represented an escalation of threat that demanded corresponding escalation of defensive response. Apache families responding to the intensified Mexican pressure of the 1830s and 1840s did not retreat into passivity. They adapted their movement patterns to reduce exposure to militia raids, developed more sophisticated early warning systems that extended the effective surveillance radius around their encampments, and consolidated into larger protective groups where the security advantages of numbers outweighed the logistical challenges of feeding more mouths from the same territory. The same adaptive capacity that had allowed Apache culture to survive and flourish in one of the most demanding environments on the continent was applied to the human threat landscape with the same systematic intelligence. The families that survived the Mexican period were those whose cultural inheritance included both the specific knowledge and the adaptive flexibility to respond to unprecedented pressure with effective innovation. The arrival of American military power in the Southwest, following the Mexican-American War, presented Apache families with a threat of a qualitatively different order. The United States Army of the 1850s was not the ragged militia force that Apache raiders had learned to evade with relative confidence. It was an organized institutional military with supply lines, logistical infrastructure, and the organizational capacity to sustain pressure over extended periods. not to mount raids and then withdraw, as militia forces typically did, but to maintain a persistent presence in Apache territory that made the seasonal movements and established resource locations that Apache survival depended upon progressively more dangerous to use. The transition to this new threat regime required Apache families to make difficult choices about which established patterns of life could be maintained and which had to be abandoned or radically modified. The families that managed this transition most successfully were those with the deepest reserves of adaptive intelligence, not necessarily the most militarily capable groups, though military capability was critically important, but the groups whose internal social coherence was strongest, whose knowledge base was broadest, whose leadership was most effective at making consequential decisions under conditions of uncertainty and time pressure. Geronimo's band, which maintained its resistance to American military power longer than any other Apache group, evading pursuit across territory that repeatedly defeated the best efforts of the United States Army, was not simply a group of exceptionally capable fighters. It was a functioning family and community structure that maintained the full range of domestic, social, and cultural life under conditions of continuous military pressure, sustained by the specific survival intelligence of its members, applied with extraordinary consistency across more than a decade of pursuit. The children who grew up within this extended period of pressure and resistance were shaped by it in ways that the adults around them deliberately managed. The transmission of survival knowledge, always an urgent priority in Apache family life, became even more concentrated and intensive during the campaign period. Girls learned the specific skills of rapid camp establishment and deconstruction at ages when children in more secure environments were still exempt from serious labor. Boys were introduced to tracking and landscape reading earlier in their development than peacetime conditions would have demanded. Not because Apache families normalized danger in a way that robbed childhood of its character, but because the intelligence adults possessed about the actual conditions their children would face as adults made earlier preparation a form of care rather than cruelty. If you've made it this far into the video, you're exactly the kind of person who should be subscribed to this channel. Hit that button right now. We put out content like this regularly, and every new subscriber makes it possible to keep going deeper into stories that most history channels never touch. The reservation period that followed the military campaigns represented a different kind of survival challenge, one that required the same fundamental adaptive intelligence applied to conditions that were, in some respects, more insidious than open military threat. The reservation system, as implemented in the Apache case, was explicitly designed not merely to contain Apache families geographically, but to transform them, to replace Apache cultural practices with Euro-American ones, to substitute English for Apache languages, to redirect Apache economic life from its traditional foundations toward farming practices poorly suited to the land and climate of the reservations to which families were assigned. The survival challenge for Apache families in this period was not simply physical, but cultural. The preservation of the knowledge, the practices, the social structures, and the spiritual frameworks that constituted Apache civilization against a sustained institutional pressure to replace them with something entirely different. The specific mechanisms through which Apache families preserved cultural continuity under reservation conditions were less dramatic than the movement strategies and tactical adaptations of the campaign period, but they were no less consequential. The continuation of language transmission, Apache mothers and grandmothers speaking to children and grandchildren in their own language in the domestic spaces that American administrators could not fully supervise, was an act of cultural preservation with profound long-term significance. The continuation of ceremonial practices, often in modified forms that reduced their visibility to disapproving agency administrators while preserving their essential character, maintained the spiritual and social dimensions of Apache life that the reservation system was designed to disrupt. The continuation of oral historical transmission, the stories and accounts and geographical knowledge that carried the community's past and its practical intelligence into the future, persisted in the evening conversations and the careful attentions of elders whose awareness of what was at risk gave their educational role an urgency that peaceful times would never have produced. The specific resilience that Apache families demonstrated through the reservation period, the capacity to maintain cultural identity and community coherence through conditions designed to erode both, was not a passive resistance, but an active, intelligent one. It required the same quality of adaptive decision-making that the campaign period had demanded, applied to a different threat landscape. Which practices could be continued without triggering administrative suppression that would cost the community more than the practice itself was worth? Which adaptations to reservation conditions were survivable compromises, and which were capitulations that would compromise the community's future capacity for recovery? These were not simple questions, and the disagreements they produced within Apache communities were genuine and sometimes bitter. The elders who counseled maximum compliance as the path of least immediate harm were not wrong about the short-term calculus. The voices that insisted on preservation of core cultural practices, regardless of administrative pressure, were not wrong about the long-term stakes. Both positions reflected serious engagement with a genuinely difficult problem, and the communities that navigated it most successfully were those that found ways to honor both imperatives without fully sacrificing either. Water knowledge survived, plant knowledge survived. The specific understanding of the Southwest landscape that had sustained Apache families through centuries of occupation persisted in the memory of elders who continued, on reservations, to transmit it to younger generations. Not because anyone expected those generations to need it in the same urgent operational sense that their grandparents had, but because the transmission of this knowledge was understood as something owed to the community's future, regardless of what that future held. The grandmother who spent an afternoon teaching a child the specific appearance of a rock formation that indicated underground water in her home territory was not training a scout. She was performing an act of love for a culture, investing in the survival of knowledge that her community had accumulated across generations, ensuring that it passed forward rather than ending with her. The Apache families, who survived the dangerous times of the 19th century, who maintained their existence, their kinship networks, their cultural knowledge, and their social structures through a period of sustained, multi-directional pressure that destroyed many indigenous communities of the American West, did so not because they were exceptional individuals in the heroic individual sense that popular narrative prefers. They survived because the civilization they inhabited had developed across generations of engagement with a demanding world, a quality of collective adaptive intelligence that proved equal to threats that no previous generation had specifically anticipated. The water knowledge, the tactical movement, the extended kinship networks, the food systems, the cultural transmission mechanisms, the spiritual frameworks that gave meaning to suffering and purpose to endurance. None of these were emergency measures improvised under crisis conditions. They were the products of a long, serious, intelligent civilization's sustained engagement with the world it inhabited. And in the most dangerous of times, that civilization proved more durable than its adversaries expected, more sophisticated than their accounts acknowledged, and more alive in the memories and communities and continued presence of Apache people today than the narrative of inevitable disappearance that American history long preferred to tell. The morning assessment of wind direction, the careful listening to the quality of silence, the grandmother's knowledge of a spring 20 miles into the mountains, the mother's speed at breaking camp, The elder's voice telling a story that carried geographical information inside its narrative, the way a river carries its cargo invisibly within its current. This is what survival looked like. Not a single heroic act, but 10,000 daily acts of intelligence, care and commitment. A civilization choosing, morning after morning, to persist. You stayed with us through all of it, and that means everything. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of this story hit you hardest. Subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with someone who thinks they know American history, because this is the version they probably never heard.